The Sunday morning alarm goes off in a small Tennessee town, but something's different. The parking lot at First Baptist Church, which once required traffic cops to manage the overflow, now has more empty spaces than cars. Inside, Pastor Jim Henderson looks out at a congregation that's shrunk by 60% in just 8 years. His hands tremble slightly as he grips the pulpit, not from nervousness, but from the weight of a truth he can barely speak aloud. After the service, in the privacy of his office, he'll make the same phone call he's made every month for the past year to the denominational headquarters, asking how much longer they can keep the doors open. He's not alone. Across the American South, a region once called the Bible Belt with such confidence it seemed carved in stone, something unprecedented is happening. Churches are closing at a rate that would have seemed impossible just 2 decades ago. And here's what makes this story so haunting. The people who know it best, the pastors themselves, often refuse to say the words out loud. In 2023, the Southern Baptist Convention reported its 16th consecutive year of membership decline. 16 years. Let that sink in for a moment. This isn't a temporary dip or a brief plateau. The SBC, America's largest Protestant denomination, lost more than 2 million members between 2006 and 2020. But even that staggering number doesn't capture the full scope of what's unfolding. In rural Georgia, 73 churches closed their doors permanently in 2022 alone. In Alabama, entire counties that once had a church on every corner now struggle to maintain even half of what they had. Mississippi, perhaps the most religiously devoted state in America by traditional measures, saw weekly church attendance drop from 47% in 2008 to 31% in 2021. The numbers tell part of the story, but the human reality tells another. In Appalachian, Kentucky, there's a United Methodist Church built in 1887 that survived the Civil War aftermath, the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and every cultural shift of the 20th century. It closed last spring. The final service had 11 people in attendance. The building, with its hand-carved pews and stained glass windows donated by families whose descendants still live in the area, sold for $14,000 to a developer who's converting it into a craft brewery. The pastor who led that final service told a local newspaper that he couldn't bring himself to watch the sale. He'd baptized children in that church, married couples, buried their grandparents. Now he works part-time at a hardware store because there aren't enough churches left in the area that can afford a full-time minister. This is the paradox that makes this collapse so difficult to discuss. The South hasn't become hostile to Christianity. There are no laws against worship, no persecution in any formal sense. In fact, if you asked most Southerners if they identify as Christian, the majority would still say yes. Politicians still invoke God in their speeches. Bless your heart, and I'll pray for you remain common phrases. On the surface, the culture looks religiously intact. But beneath that surface, the foundation has developed cracks so severe that the entire structure is shifting. By the way, before we go further into the story, I'm curious about something. Where in the world are you watching this from? Are you in the American South yourself witnessing these changes firsthand? Or are you somewhere else entirely, wondering if this same pattern is happening where you live? Drop a comment and let me know. And what time is it for you right now? I'm always fascinated to see who's watching at 3 in the afternoon versus 3 in the morning. This is Professor Archive, and if you're finding value in this deep dive into a phenomenon that's reshaping American culture, consider hitting that like button, or if you're feeling generous, a super thanks goes a long way in helping us continue producing these documentaries. Now, to understand why this implosion is happening, we need to rewind to what the South was, religiously speaking. The Bible Belt wasn't just a nickname, it was a lived reality. In the 1970s, regular church attendance in states like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Tennessee hovered between 55 and 65% of the population. Churches weren't just places of worship, they were the primary social infrastructure. If you wanted to network for business, you went to church. If you wanted to meet potential romantic partners, you went to church. If you wanted your children to have friends to build connections that would last a lifetime, you sent them to church youth groups. Being unchurched in much of the South during this era meant being genuinely socially isolated. The power of this system was self-reinforcing. When everyone goes to church, not going becomes socially costly. It's not just about belief or even personal piety. It's about belonging to your community. A 1985 study in rural Arkansas found that 78% of business contracts and partnerships in towns under 5,000 people were formed through church connections. Wedding receptions were held in church fellowship halls. Church directories served as community phone books. When someone got sick or lost a job, the church organized meal trains and financial support. This wasn't just religion. This was the operating system of Southern social life. But then something shifted. The timeline is crucial here because it helps us understand why pastors struggle to name what's happening. The decline didn't start with some dramatic event. There was no singular moment when people woke up and decided to abandon faith. Instead, it began with barely perceptible changes in the 1990s, accelerated in the early 2000s, and then went into freefall after 2012. In 1972, only 7% of Americans claimed no religious affiliation. By 2021, that number had reached 29% nationally. But in the South, the change was even more dramatic because it started from such a high baseline. In 1990, regular church attendance in Tennessee was 52%. In 2019, before COVID, it was 33%. That's a 36% decline in regular attendance in less than 30 years. For context, the Roman Catholic Church in Latin America, which has seen significant secularization, experienced about a 22% decline over a similar period. The Southern implosion is happening faster than almost any comparable religious shift in the modern world outside of communist state suppression. What makes this particularly devastating for Southern churches is that they weren't prepared. The infrastructure, both physical and organizational, was built for growth, not decline. In the 1980s and 1990s, churches throughout the South engaged in massive building campaigns. Megachurches constructed worship centers seating thousands. Medium-sized churches built family life centers with gymnasiums, coffee shops, and bookstores. Small churches took on debt to expand sanctuaries and add educational wings. The assumption was always that the next generation would be larger than the last. A Baptist pastor in North Carolina took out a $1.2 million loan in 1998 to build a new sanctuary seating 800 people. At the time, the church had 500 regular attenders and was growing. By 2018, attendance had dropped to 170. The debt remained. The church filed for bankruptcy in 2019 and sold the building to a private equity firm that converted it into a gym and office complex. The pastor, who'd served that congregation for 34 years, told an interviewer that he still drives by sometimes and sees people working out in what used to be the sanctuary. He said it feels like attending his own funeral while still alive. There are now entire denominational offices dedicated to what they euphemistically call church revitalization, which is often just a gentle way of managing decline and consolidation. The United Methodist Church's North Georgia Conference has a consultant whose primary job is helping churches navigate closure. He visits an average of 13 dying churches per month. Most, he says, have fewer than 20 regular attenders, aging congregations, and no realistic path to sustainability. The conversations, he reports, are heartbreaking. These churches are often the last institution left in small communities. When they close, something irreplaceable vanishes. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The crisis isn't just about numbers declining. It's about who's leaving and why. And this is the part that pastors find hardest to discuss, because it challenges some deeply held assumptions about how faith works. The traditional narrative about religious decline goes something like this. Young people leave for college, get exposed to secular ideas, lose their faith, and never come back. It's a tale of generational rebellion, of modernity corrupting traditional values. But the data from the South tells a more complex and frankly more disturbing story for those trying to reverse the trend. People aren't leaving primarily because they stopped believing in God. They're leaving because church stopped being relevant to their actual lives. A 2019 study by the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship surveyed 2,000 people in 5 southern states who'd left churches they'd attended for at least 5 years. The results surprised even the researchers. Only 18% cited doubts about Christian theology as their primary reason for leaving. 12% mentioned science and religion conflicts. Those were far down the list. The top reason, cited by 47%, was what they called authentic community breakdown. In plain English, church stopped being a place where they felt genuinely known and connected to others. The second most common reason was ethical disillusionment, particularly around issues of race, poverty, and how churches handled abuse allegations. This distinction is crucial. The South isn't primarily experiencing a crisis of belief. It's experiencing a crisis of belonging and trust, and that's why it's so hard to fix. You can address theological doubts with apologetics, with better teaching, with youth programs designed to strengthen conviction. But how do you rebuild trust once it's shattered? How do you recreate authentic community in an era when people have countless other options for social connection? The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated this crisis in ways that won't be fully understood for years. When churches across the South closed their doors in March 2020, something remarkable happened. Millions of regular churchgoers discovered they didn't miss it as much as they'd expected. Online services initially seemed like a temporary solution, a way to maintain connection during lockdowns, but for many they became a revelation. You could watch a sermon in your pajamas, skip the parts that didn't interest you, avoid awkward social interactions, and still feel like you'd fulfilled your spiritual obligations. When churches reopened, a significant percentage never came back. Data from Lifeway Research found that among Protestant churches surveyed in late 2021, in-person attendance was still at only 76% of pre-pandemic levels. But here's the fascinating part. Many of those missing people were still watching online. They'd found a way to maintain a connection to their faith while opting out of the institutional church. For church finances, this was catastrophic. Online viewers don't tithe at the same rate as in-person attenders. They don't volunteer for ministry programs. They don't bring their children to youth groups. They become consumers of content rather than participants in community. A megachurch outside of Atlanta provides a stark example. Before COVID, they averaged 4,200 in-person attendance across multiple services each Sunday. Their online viewership was around 800. After reopening in mid-2021, in-person attendance stabilized at 2,600. But online viewership had grown to 3,400. In total, they were reaching about 6,000 people, up from 5,000 pre-pandemic. On paper, that looks like growth, but their giving dropped by 31%. They had to lay off 43 staff members, cancel building expansion plans, and discontinue several community programs. The lead pastor said in a leaked internal meeting recording that they were watching their church evaporate in slow motion. Now we need to talk about something that makes even discussing this collapse controversial: the political dimension. In the South, white evangelical churches in particular became increasingly aligned with conservative Republican politics over the past 4 decades. This wasn't subtle. Churches hosted voter registration drives, pastors endorsed candidates from the pulpit despite tax code restrictions, and the line between Christian identity and partisan identity blurred until they were virtually indistinguishable in many communities. For a while, this seemed like a winning strategy. The political power it delivered was real, but it came with a cost that's now becoming apparent. Younger Southerners, including those raised in conservative Christian homes, began associating Christianity not primarily with Jesus or the gospel, but with a political brand. And when that brand became unappealing to them, they left the whole package behind. Research by the Public Religion Research Institute found that among Southern adults under 35 who'd left evangelical churches, 61% cited the church's political stances as a major factor. For many, there was a specific breaking point: the 2016 presidential election and its aftermath. The overwhelming support that white evangelical churches gave to Donald Trump, despite his personal conduct and rhetoric that seemed at odds with traditional Christian values, created a crisis of cognitive dissonance. Young people who'd been taught that character matters, that personal morality was central to Christian witness, watch their pastors and church leaders enthusiastically support someone who seemed to violate those very principles. The message they received was clear. Political power matters more than moral consistency. One woman from a small town in South Carolina described her experience this way in an interview with researchers. "I was 23, still going to the church I grew up in. After the election, my pastor gave a sermon basically saying that God had used an imperfect vessel to save America. I sat there thinking about all the purity culture stuff they'd put us through as teenagers, the true love waits pledges, the modesty rules, the shame around sexuality. And now they were making excuses for behavior they would have condemned in any of us. I never went back. It wasn't about politics, really. It was about realizing they didn't actually believe what they'd spent my whole childhood telling me was non-negotiable." This pattern repeated itself thousands of times across the South. And here's the devastating part for churches trying to recover. Those people aren't coming back. They didn't just leave for a break. They fundamentally reassessed what they'd been taught and concluded the institution had lost its moral authority. You can't undo that with better music or more dynamic preaching. But the racial dimension goes even deeper and further back. The Southern Baptist Convention was literally founded in 1845 as a split from Northern Baptists over slavery. While the denomination issued an apology for its racist origins in 1995, the lived reality of racial segregation in Southern churches remains stark. Sunday morning, as Martin Luther King Jr. famously observed, remains the most segregated hour in America. In 2020, only 13% of Southern evangelical churches were multiracial, defined as having at least 20% of the congregation from a different racial background than the majority. The murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning that followed created another fracture point. Many younger white Southerners, including committed Christians, began confronting the reality of systemic racism and expecting their churches to do the same. Some churches responded with compassion and self-examination, but many reacted defensively, framing conversations about racial justice as dangerous cultural Marxism, incompatible with biblical faith. This drove another wave of departures, particularly among those under 40. Meanwhile, black churches in the South, while more stable than their white evangelical counterparts, face their own crisis. Younger African Americans are leaving at significant rates as well, though for different reasons. Many cite frustration with what they see as patriarchal leadership structures, homophobia, and an emphasis on personal salvation that ignores structural injustice. The Black church, which was the backbone of the civil rights movement, now struggles to maintain relevance with a generation that approaches activism differently. There's also an economic dimension to this implosion that rarely gets discussed. The South has changed economically. Jobs that once kept people rooted in small towns for generations have disappeared. Young people leave for cities, not just in the South but across the country, seeking opportunities, and when they leave, they encounter different religious landscapes. In urban environments, the social cost of not attending church is minimal. Nobody asks why you weren't at service on Sunday. You can build a full social life without any church involvement. For many Southern transplants to cities like Austin, Nashville, or even outside the region, this comes as a relief. They discover they can maintain their faith, if they choose to, without the institutional baggage of the churches they grew up in. The rural South, meanwhile, is experiencing a demographic death spiral. Counties are literally losing population as young people leave, and older residents age. Churches in these areas face impossible mathematics. Fixed costs like building maintenance, utilities, and insurance don't decline just because attendance does. A church that once had 200 members sharing those costs now has 60 members, many on fixed incomes, trying to maintain the same building. It doesn't work. The result is wave after wave of closures, consolidations, and dying congregations that can't afford to call pastors. The denominational structures built during the growth era are collapsing too. The Southern Baptist Convention operates on a voluntary cooperative funding model. Churches send a percentage of their tithes to state conventions and the national organization, which then funds seminaries, mission boards, and denominational agencies. But as church giving declines, so do these cooperative program contributions. Between 2010 and 2020, the SBC's cooperative program receipts fell from $202 million to $155 million, a 23% decline. Seminaries have had to cut faculty, mission boards have reduced overseas personnel, and denominational agencies have laid off staff. What's emerging in some places is a stripped-down, almost entrepreneurial approach to ministry. Pastor-led house churches, non-denominational gatherings in unconventional spaces, faith communities that reject the traditional institutional model altogether. Some of these are vital and growing, but they're reaching a different demographic, often people who were never deeply churched to begin with. They're not replacing what's being lost in terms of the social infrastructure that traditional Southern churches provided. There's also the uncomfortable reality that some churches are responding to decline by becoming more extreme, not less. When moderate members leave, the remaining core often becomes more ideologically rigid. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. The church becomes more politically conservative, more culturally combative, more insular. This pleases the remaining members but makes it even harder to attract new ones or bring back those who've left. Some churches that were once broad-tent community institutions are becoming essentially political organizing spaces that happen to have religious elements. The scandal dimension cannot be ignored either. The Southern Baptist Convention's sexual abuse crisis, revealed through extensive investigative reporting and an independent investigation released in 2022, documented decades of abuse cover-ups, victim intimidation, and institutional protection of predators. The report identified more than 700 cases of abuse within SBC churches and described a pattern of leadership dismissing and attacking survivors who came forward. For many, this was a final straw. How could they trust institutions that protected abusers over victims, that valued reputation over justice, that prioritized institutional survival over the vulnerable? Similar patterns emerged in other denominations. The Catholic Church's abuse scandals weren't limited to the North. Southern dioceses had their own horrific revelations. Independent Baptist churches, which operate without denominational oversight, have been linked to numerous abuse cases with virtually no accountability structures. Each revelation drives more people away, and particularly drives away parents who see these institutions as unsafe for their children. Now, here's what might be the deepest source of pastoral fear in naming this collapse. It challenges the entire framework through which they've understood their calling and their faith. For generations, Southern pastors operated within a narrative of Christian America, of the South as a light to the nation, of churches as essential institutions that would endure because they represented timeless truth. The current reality contradicts all of that. It suggests that what they thought was bedrock faith was in many cases cultural Christianity, habit, and social pressure rather than deep conviction. To name this collapse honestly would require admitting that the strategies of the past several decades have failed. It would mean acknowledging that the political alliances were damaging. It would mean confronting uncomfortable realities about racism, abuse, and institutional corruption. It would mean questioning whether bigger buildings, better programs, and more entertaining services ever address the actual spiritual hunger people have. For many pastors, especially those who've spent entire careers within the system, that level of honesty is psychologically and spiritually threatening. It's easier to focus on the few who remain, to interpret any small sign as evidence of coming revival, to blame decline on cultural forces beyond their control. But there are pastors who are naming it. They're admitting from their pulpits that the institutional church is dying in its current form. They're having honest conversations about failures and sins. They're trying to imagine what comes next. These are often smaller churches, pastors who've decided they'd rather lead faithful communities of 20 than maintain the illusion of success in declining institutions of 200. One such pastor in rural Mississippi described his experience this way. "I finally told my congregation the truth. We're dying. This church probably won't exist in 10 years unless something radical changes. And I said, maybe that's okay. Maybe we've been so focused on preserving the institution that we forgot what we're actually supposed to be about. Maybe we need to die so something new can emerge." People cried, some got angry. But you know what? For the first time in years, we had an honest conversation about what church is supposed to be. The question of what comes next is genuinely unclear. Some predict a complete collapse of institutional Christianity in the South within a generation, leaving only scattered pockets of committed believers. Others see signs of renewal, of new forms of Christian community emerging from the ruins of the old institutional church. Still others think we'll see a two-tier system: wealthy, successful megachurches that function almost like entertainment complexes, and small, committed communities of serious practitioners with very little in between. What seems certain is that the South of 50 years from now will look religiously unrecognizable compared to the South of 50 years ago. The Bible Belt as we've known it is unraveling. Whether what replaces it will be better or worse, more faithful or less, more just or more fractured, depends on choices being made right now by millions of people, including those watching this video. Some regions are already experiencing what life looks like post-church dominance. In parts of urban North Carolina and Tennessee, being Christian is no longer a default identity. It's a choice, one option among many. This has led to an interesting paradox. The churches that remain tend to have more committed members because they're there by choice rather than social obligation. But they also have far less cultural influence. They're communities within a pluralistic landscape rather than the dominant institutions that shape the whole culture. The economic consequences of this implosion extend beyond individual churches. Entire industries built around Southern church culture are collapsing. Christian bookstores are nearly extinct. Christian music festivals that once drew tens of thousands are being canceled. Religious publishing houses are downsizing. Bible colleges and seminaries are closing or drastically reducing enrollment. In small southern towns, the church was often one of the largest employers when you counted full-time pastors, administrative staff, preschool and childcare workers, and maintenance personnel. Those jobs are vanishing. There's also the question of what happens to the buildings themselves. Across the South, there are thousands of church buildings that have been or will be decommissioned. Some become community centers, art spaces, or private residences. Others sit empty and deteriorate, becoming neighborhood eyesores. A few get converted to bars or nightclubs, a transformation that carries heavy symbolism. Each conversion represents not just a real estate transaction, but a cultural shift, a literal repurposing of sacred space for secular use. What about the people who stay? For those who remain committed to traditional Southern churches, the experience is increasingly one of siege mentality. They see themselves as faithful remnants in a hostile culture, preserving truth while others fall away. This creates a strong sense of identity and purpose, but also tends toward insularity. The church becomes a refuge from the world rather than an institution engaged with it. Whether this is faithful Christianity or a retreat into a safety that was never promised in the gospel is a question they wrestle with constantly. And what about those who've left? For some, it's liberation. They describe feeling free from guilt, from judgment, from expectations that never fit who they are. They build lives with different sources of meaning and community. But for others, there's profound loss. They miss aspects of church life: the music, the rituals, the sense of connection to something larger than themselves, the framework faith provided for understanding suffering and purpose. Many are what sociologists call religiously homeless, people who've left institutional religion but haven't found a satisfying replacement. They're spiritual but not religious, a phrase that often describes not contentment but longing. Some observers predict we'll see a return. They point to the fact that humans seem to have an inherent religious impulse, that purely secular societies have their own problems with meaning and community. They suggest that younger generations, after experiencing the emptiness of consumerism and individualism, will rediscover the value of faith communities. Maybe, but if there is a return, it likely won't be to churches that look like what's dying now. It will require institutions that have learned from their failures, that offer authentic community without coercion, that demonstrate moral integrity, that embrace rather than fear diversity, that engage culture thoughtfully rather than reactively.